Gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. The Institute of Politics is very pleased to host its annual celebration of the birthday of President John F. Kennedy. The Institute of Politics was created as a living memorial to the President, who inspired so many of us to participate in politics and in public service. His leadership captured imaginations around the world with the sense of commitment, the sense of excitement, and the sense of challenge that public service can represent, whether in reaching out to others through the Peace Corps or reaching for the moon. From the contributions of millions of Americans, many of them school children, the Presidential Library was born, and the endowment was established at Harvard, creating a nonpartisan institute to encourage today's young people to take up the challenge of citizenship and of leadership. It is my privilege to introduce one of America's foremost leaders today, who is on the Institute of Politics Senior Advisory Board, and in that capacity gives generously of his time in order to help us carry out our mission to the young people here at Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Edward M. Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Phil Sharp, who is doing such a wonderful job as the director of the Institute of Politics, Dean Nye. We are so grateful for your service and leadership here at the Kennedy School. Old friends Galbraith and Kitty. It's an honor to be here this afternoon. Our family is proud of this school of government and proud of the Institute of Politics. In many ways, it's a perfect memorial to my brother. I know he had relished the extraordinary combination of academic excellence and public service that are the trademarks of the Institute and of the entire School of Government that bears his name. I'm also proud of the leadership here of Dean Nye and Director Sharp. In fact, I had the privilege of working closely with both of them on a number of key issues, and I have great respect for their ability and their commitment to President Kennedy's ideals. Besides, I'm glad to be here for another reason, to serve as the warm-up act for my nephew, John. He keeps asking me what I'm going to do next. I don't think he wants to be a senator, at least not from Massachusetts. Today's topic is especially timely. This year's race for the White House will be the first one fought in the information age. 1960 is a long time ago for most people. Often to me, however, it seems like only yesterday. In politics, 1960 was the dawn of the television age. I suspect, though, that 36 years from now, your children will think the high-tech campaign techniques we'll hear about today are every bit as quaint as the 1960 campaign now seems to all of us. The 1992 presidential campaign was a test flight. An obscure academic institution across the Charles, known by the initials of MIT, conducted an experiment in online politics by hosting the Presidential Campaign Information Service. It was an internet-based resource. It was used by Bill Clinton, George Bush, Ross Perot, and to distribute information about their campaigns and communicate with voters. It was launched only weeks before Election Day, but it handled thousands of requests a day for campaign information. The Clinton campaign used it more extensively than anyone else. Once elected, President Clinton and Vice President Gore brought the White House online as well. Then came the elections of 1994. A handful of congressional campaigns, including my own here in Massachusetts, explored the possibilities of using cyberspace more effectively. I'm keeping my homepage current. If you want to look me up, here's my address, www.senate.gov. Just click on Kennedy. The hot issue today is the minimum wage. Look me up and read all about it in living color. You'll even find the latest Red Sox scores. The campaigns of '96 are already becoming the next stage of technology. It's clear that internet campaigning is no longer just an experiment or an exception to the rule. Presence on the internet will now be as prevalent as yard signs and bumper stickers. The question is, will it have a real impact? There are still more questions than answers about how to conduct an internet campaign. But one thing is certain, candidates won't risk the possibility that the net could be a significant factor in the election. They'll hedge their bets by putting their campaigns online as effectively as possible. But I think it's safe to say that by the time the Final Four next March, the phrase "nothing but net" will still be more applicable to basketball than to politics. Nevertheless, more and more elected officials are discovering the net. Of the 4 Republican senators who competed for their party's presidential nomination this year, Bob Dole, Phil Gramm, Dick Lugar, and Arlen Specter, all of them had their presidential campaigns on the Internet several months before the primary. Yet not one of them has made the effort to bring their Senate office online. There seems to be 2 strong incentives attracting candidates to the Internet. One is the opportunity to reach very large numbers of supporters. The other is a financial breakthrough, the chance to solicit a large number of online campaign contributors. The case for seeking supporters by using the net is strong and getting stronger. Millions of Americans have access to it. They already search the net for information on every possible subject. They obviously use it to find out about political candidates. Unlike a TV commercial or a campaign brochure that arrives in the mail or a canvass by telephone or by doorbell, the Internet is not intrusive. Voters will be inclined to visit a candidate's site because it's much more convenient than a trip to the campaign headquarters. They'll be able to obtain far more information about the candidates and the issues than in any 30-second TV spot or brochure. Passive supporters who are interested in becoming more and more active will learn how to volunteer and help their candidate. Undecided voters will be able to get the information they need to reach a decision. And I'm sure that negative campaigning will reach a new high, or more likely, a new low. I doubt that anyone would argue that the online aspects of the Republican primary had a significant impact on the outcome of this year. The governor of South Carolina, Carol Campbell, actually the former governor, threw Bob Dole a safety net, not the Internet, and that was that. What is clear, though, is that the road to the White House in 1996 will pass through a new state. It's a state without borders, a state without ballots, a state without any electoral votes, but a very important state nonetheless. You could call it the cyber state, and you can be sure it'll be organized, solicited, and fought over in both the presidential campaigns and other campaigns. And in the process, America will enter a new age of politics unlike any we've known before, just as we did in 1960. Thank you.
It's a privilege to be here again this year and once again to participate in another IOP forum on today, the day that we give out the Profiles and Courage Award. It is, whether it's coming to a board meeting at the IOP or to these forums, it's always nice for a Brown alumni to return to Harvard. The topic for this year's forum is particularly timely as we're in the midst of another presidential campaign. As we look back to the 1960 campaign, the debates stand out as a highlight. They were the first presidential debates ever televised, and for the first time in history, most of the American people, an estimated 80 million viewers, were able to see and hear both major candidates state their views and question each other face to face. The debate certainly exceeded the expectations of everyone involved, from campaign operatives to political commentators to the American public and perhaps to the candidates themselves. The use of this relatively new technology certainly had an impact which changed political campaigns forevermore. For example, polls following the debate showed that those who watched them on TV thought that John Kennedy had won, and those listening to them on the radio thought that Richard Nixon had won. This afternoon, we'll take a look at those debates in a film that has been prepared for this forum. Then, with the excellent and highly experienced panel that we have, we'll discuss the impact of television in the 60 campaign, and we'll take a look at what new technologies, including cable television, the Internet, and more, are affecting the 1996 campaign. We'll begin now by showing a short film which has been prepared for us by the John F. Kennedy Library. The film opens with clips of each of the 4 televised presidential debates in the fall of 1960. One of the questioners in the first debate was Sander Van Oker, who was with NBC News then and is here with us this afternoon. You'll see a clip of Mr. Van Oker asking Richard Nixon a question in this film. It's interesting to note that the third debate was done by live remote. Richard Nixon was in Los Angeles, John Kennedy was in New York, and this was another first in presidential campaign history. I wanted to just briefly recognize, before we started the film, the 1996 Profiles in Courage Award winner, Mr. Corkin Cherubini, who is the superintendent of Calhoun County Schools in Georgia. He's here with his wife Phyllis and his daughter Ann, and Mr. Cherubini earned this the distinction after he was elected superintendent of Calhoun County Schools, spoke out against the educational tracking system, which he believed amounted to a sort of educational apartheid, placing black students in remedial classes and white students in advanced level from virtually the first day of school. We also are very pleased to announce the 1996 Profiles in Courage Award High School Essay Contest, and we have the winner, Ari Robin Haft, who is seated there. Just give him a hand. Mr. Robin Haft wrote an essay on Senator Wayne Morse, who voted against one of the very few senators that voted against the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Now on to the film. I'm grateful to Alan Goodrich and James Hill of the Kennedy Library for putting this film together, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
If a question comes from one of the panel, you naturally would want to look at the man asking the question. But when you answer, I will cut to that camera so that the home audience is on the Kennedy camera and the home audience is on the Nixon camera. Can we strike this right away, please, and put the other leg turning in? Are you voting this November? Yes. For whom?
Kennedy. Best man, I guess, be Nixon.
Kennedy. I'm undecided as yet. I want to see the rest of the debates, especially the ones on television.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
This is the second in a series of programs unmatched in history. Never have so many people seen the major candidates for President of the United States at the same time. And never, until this series, have Americans seen the candidates in face-to-face exchange.
It's my privilege this evening to preside at this, the third in the series of meetings on radio and television of the two major presidential candidates. Unlike the first two programs, however, the two candidates will not be sharing the same platform. In New York, the Democratic presidential nominee, Senator John F. Kennedy. Separated by 3,000 miles in a Los Angeles studio, the Republican presidential nominee, Vice President Richard M. Nixon. Now joined for tonight's discussion by a network of electronic facilities which permits each candidate to see and hear the other.
I'm Quincy Howe of ABC News saying good evening from New York, where the two major candidates for President of the United States are about to engage in their fourth radio-television discussion of the present campaign.
The next question to Vice President Nixon from Mr. Van Oker.
Mr. Vice President, since the question of executive leadership is a very important campaign issue, I'd like to follow Mr. Novin's question. Now, Republican campaign slogans, you see them on signs around the country as we did last week, say, it's experience that counts. That's over a picture of yourself, sir. Implying that you've had more governmental executive decision-making experience than your opponent. Now, in his news conference on August 24th, President Eisenhower was asked to give one example of a major idea of yours that he adopted. His reply was, and I'm quoting, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Now, that was a month ago, sir, and the President hasn't brought it up since. And I'm wondering, sir, if you can clarify which version is correct, the one put out by Republican campaign leaders or the one put out by President Eisenhower?
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Van Oker, that if you know the President, that was probably a facetious remark. I would also suggest that insofar as his statement is concerned, that I think it would be improper for the President of the United States to disclose the instances in which members of his official family had made recommendations, as I have made them through the years, to him which he has accepted or rejected. The President has always maintained, and very properly so, that he is entitled to get what advice he wants from his cabinet and from his other advisors without disclosing that to anybody, including, as a matter of fact, to Congress. Now, I can only say this. Through the years, I have sat in the National Security Council. I have been in the cabinet. I have met with the legislative leaders. I have met with the president when he made the great decisions with regard to Lebanon, Chimoy Matsu, other matters. The president has asked for my advice. I have given it. Sometimes my advice has been taken. Sometimes it is not. I do not say that I have made the decision. And I would say that no president should ever allow anybody else to make the major decisions. The president only makes the decision. All that his advisors do is to give counsel when he asks for it. As far as what experience counts and whether that is experience that counts, that isn't for me to say. I can only say that my experience is there for the people to consider. Senator Kennedy's is there for the people to consider. As he pointed out, we came to the Congress in the same year. His experience has been different from mine. Mine has been in the executive branch. His has been in the legislative branch. I would say that the people now have the opportunity to evaluate his as against mine, and I think both he and I are going to abide by whatever the people decide.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, I'll just say that the question is of experience, and the question also is what our judgment is of the future, and what our goals are for the United States, and what ability we have to implement those goals. Abraham Lincoln came to the presidency in 1860 after a rather little-known session in the House of Representatives, and after being defeated for the Senate in 58 and was a distinguished president. There is no certain road to the presidency. There are no guarantees that if you take the one road or another that you will be a successful president. I have been in the Congress for 14 years. I have voted in the last 8 years. When the Vice President was presiding over the Senate and meeting his other responsibilities. I have met decisions over 800 times on matters which affect not only the domestic security of the United States, but as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The question really is, which candidate and which party can meet the problems that the United States is going to face in the 60s?
The next question to Senator Kennedy from Mr. Novins.
Senator Kennedy, in connection with these problems of the future that you speak of and the program that you enunciated earlier in your direct talk, you call for expanding some of the welfare programs for schools, for teacher salaries, medical care, and so forth, but you also call for reducing the federal debt. And I'm wondering how you, if you're president in January, would go about paying the bill for all this. Does this mean that
I did not advocate reducing the federal debt because I don't believe that you're going to be able to reduce the federal debt very much in 1961, 2, or 3. I think you have heavy obligations which affect our security, which we're going to have to meet. And therefore, I've never suggested we should be able to retire the debt substantially or even at all in 1961 or 2.
Senator, I believe in one of your speeches you suggested that reducing the interest rate would help toward...
No, not reducing the interest. Reducing the interest rate, in my judgment, the hard money, tight money policy, fiscal policy of this administration has contributed to the slowdown in our economy, which helped bring the recession of 54, which made the recession of 58 rather intense, and which has slowed somewhat our economic activity in 1960. What I have talked about, however, the kind of programs that I talk about, in my judgment, are fiscally sound. Medical care for the aged, I would put under Social Security. The Vice President and I disagree on this. The program, the Javits-Nixon or the Nixon-Javits program, would have cost, if fully used, $600 million by the government per year and $600 million by the state. The program which I advocated, which failed by 5 votes in the United States Senate, would have put medical care for the aged in Social Security and would have been paid for through the Social Security system and the Social Security tax. Secondly, I support federal aid to education and federal aid for teacher salaries. I think that's a good investment. I think we're going to have to do it. And I think to heap the burden further on the property tax, which is already strained in many of our communities, will ensure, in my opinion, that many of our children will not be adequately educated and many of our teachers not adequately compensated. There is no greater return to an economy or to a society in an educational system second to none. In the question of the development of natural resources, I would pay as you go, in the sense that they would be balanced and the power revenues would bring back sufficient money to finance the projects, in the same way as the Tennessee Valley. I believe in the balanced budget, and the only conditions under which I would unbalance the budget would be if there was a grave national emergency or a serious recession. Otherwise, with a steady rate of economic growth, and Mr. Nixon and Mr. Rockefeller in their meeting said a 5% economic growth would bring by 1962 $10 billion extra in tax revenue. Whatever is brought in, I think that we can finance essential programs within a balanced budget if business remains orderly.
Yes. I think what Mr. Novin was referring to was not one of Senator Kennedy's speeches, but the Democratic platform, which did mention cutting the national debt. I think, too, that it should be pointed out that, of course, it is not possible, particularly under the proposals that Senator Kennedy has advocated, either to cut the national debt or to reduce taxes. As a matter of fact, it will be necessary to raise taxes. As Senator Kennedy points out, that as far as his one proposal is concerned, the one for medical care for the aged, that would be financed out of Social Security. That, however, is raising taxes for those who pay Social Security. He points out that he would make pay-as-you-go be the basis for our natural resources development. For our natural resources development, which I also support incidentally, however, whenever you appropriate money for one of these projects, you have to pay now and appropriate the money, and while they eventually do pay out, it doesn't mean that the government doesn't have to put out the money this year. And so I would say that in all of these proposals Senator Kennedy has made, they will result in one of two things. Either he has to raise taxes or he has to unbalance the budget. If he unbalances the budget, that means you have inflation, and that will be, of course, a very cruel blow to the very people, the older people that we've been talking about. As far as aid for school construction is concerned, I favor that, as Senator Kennedy did in January of this year, when he said he favored that rather than aid to teacher salaries. I favor that because I believe that's the best way to aid our schools without running any risk whatever of the federal government telling our teachers what to teach.
The next question.
Mr. Von Fremd has a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, I'd like to shift the conversation, if I may, to a domestic political argument. The chairman of the Republican National Committee, Senator Thurston Morton, declared earlier this week that you owed Vice President Nixon and the Republican Party a public apology for some strong charges made by former President Harry Truman, who bluntly suggested where the Vice President and the Republican Party could go. Do you feel that you owe the Vice President an apology?
Well, I must say that Mr. Truman has his methods of expressing things. He's been in politics for 50 years. He's been President of the United States. Maybe not my style, but I really don't think there's anything that I can say to President Truman that's going to cause him at the age of 76 to change his particular speaking manner. Perhaps Mrs. Truman can, but I don't think I can. I just have to tell Mr. Morton that, if you'd pass that message on to him.
Any comment, Mr. Vice President?
Yes, I think so. Of course, both Senator Kennedy and I have felt Mr. Truman's ire, and consequently, I think he can speak with some feeling on this subject. I just do want to say one thing, however. We all have tempers. I have one. I'm sure Senator Kennedy has one. But when a man's president of the United States or a former president, he has an obligation not to lose his temper in public. One thing I've noted as I've traveled around the country are the tremendous number of children who come out to see the presidential candidates. I see mothers holding their babies up so that they can see a man who might be president of the United States. I know Senator Kennedy sees them too. It makes you realize that whoever is president is going to be a man that all the children of America will either look up to or will look down to. And I can only say that I'm very proud that President Eisenhower restored dignity and decency and, frankly, good language to the conduct of the presidency of the United States. And I only hope that, should I win this election, that I could approach President Eisenhower in maintaining the dignity of the office, in seeing to it that whenever any mother or father talks to his child, he can look at the man in the White House, and whatever he may think of his policies, he will say, well, there is a man who maintains the kind of standards personally that I would want my child to follow.
Walter Cronkite, you have your first question for Vice President Nixon.
Thank you, Quincy. Mr. Vice President, Senator Fulbright, and now tonight Senator Kennedy, maintain that the administration is suppressing a report by the United States Information Agency that shows a decline in United States prestige overseas. Are you aware of such a report? And if you are aware of the existence of such a report, should not that report, because of the great importance this issue has been given in this campaign, be released to the public?
Mr. Cronkite, I naturally am aware of it because I, of course, pay attention to everything Senator Kennedy says, as well as Senator Fulbright. Now, in this connection, I want to point out that the facts simply aren't as stated. First of all, the report to which Senator Kennedy refers is one that was made many, many months ago and related particularly to the period immediately after Sputnik. Second, as far as this report is concerned, I would have no objection to having it made public. Third, I would say this with regard to this report, with regard to Gallup polls of prestige abroad, and everything else that we've been hearing about. What about American prestige abroad? America's prestige abroad will be just as high as the spokesmen for America allow it to be. Now, when we have a presidential candidate, for example, Senator Kennedy, stating over and over again that the United States is second in space, and the fact of the matter is that the space score today is 28-8. We've had 28 successful shots, they've had 8. When he states that we're second in education, and I have seen Soviet education, and I've seen ours, and we're not, that we're second in science, because they may be ahead in one area or another, when overall we're way ahead of the Soviet Union and all other countries in science. When he says, as he did in January of this year, that we have the worst slums, that we have the most crowded schools, when he says that 17 million people go to bed hungry every night, when he makes statements like this, what does this do to American prestige? Well, it can only have the effect, certainly, of reducing it. Let me make one thing clear. Senator Kennedy has a responsibility to criticize those things that are wrong, but he has also a responsibility to be right in his criticism. Every one of these items that I've mentioned, he's been wrong, dead wrong. And for that reason, he has contributed to any lack of prestige. Finally, let me say this. As far as prestige is concerned, the first place it would show up would be in the United Nations. Now, Senator Kennedy has referred to the vote on communist China. Let's look at the vote on Hungary. There we got more votes for condemning Hungary and looking into that situation than we got the last year. Let's look at the reaction to Khrushchev and Eisenhower at the last UN session. Did Khrushchev gain because he took his shoe off and pounded the table and shouted and insulted? Not at all. The president gained, America gained, by continuing the dignity, the decency that has characterized us, and it's that that keeps the prestige of America up, not running down America the way Senator Kennedy's been running her down.
Comment, Senator Kennedy?
I really don't need Mr. Nixon to tell me about what my responsibilities are as a citizen. I've served this country for 14 years in the Congress and before that in the service. I have just as high a devotion, just as high an opinion. What I downgrade, Mr. Nixon, is the leadership the country's getting, not the country. Now, I didn't make most of the statements that you said I made. I believe the Soviet Union is first in outer space. We may have made more shots, the size of their rocket thrust, and all the rest. You yourself said to Khrushchev, you may be ahead of us in rocket thrust, but we're ahead of you in color television, in your famous discussion in the kitchen. I think that color television is not as important as rocket thrust. Secondly, I didn't say we had the worst slums in the world. I said we had too many slums, and that they are bad, and we ought to do something about them, and we ought to support housing legislation, which this administration has opposed. I didn't say we had the worst education in the world. What I said was that 10 years ago, we were producing twice as many scientists and engineers as the Soviet Union, and today they're producing twice as many as we are, and that this affects our security around the world. And fourth, I believe that the polls and other studies and votes in the United Nations and anyone reading the paper and any citizen of the United States must come to the conclusion that the United States no longer carries the same image of a vital society on the move with its brightest days ahead as it carried a decade or 2 decades ago. Part of that is because we've stood still here at home, because we haven't met our problems in the United States, because we haven't had a moving economy. Part of that, as the Gallup poll show, is because the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in outer space. Mr. George Allen, head of your information service, has said that that made the people of the world begin to wonder whether we were first in science. We're first in other areas of science, but in space, which is the new science, we're not first.
Both candidates have asked me to express their thanks to the networks for this opportunity to appear on this discussion. May I repeat that all those concerned in tonight's discussion have, sometimes reluctantly, followed the rules and conditions read at the outset and agreed to in advance by the candidates and the networks. One last word. As members of a new political generation, Vice President Nixon and Senator Kennedy have used new means of communication to pioneer a new type of political debate. The character and courage with which these two men have spoken sets a high standard for generations to come. Surely they have set a new precedent. Perhaps they have established a new tradition. This is Quincy Howe.
This is Bill Shadell.
This is Frank McGee.
This is Howard K. Smith. Good night from Chicago.
We're very pleased to have here with us today a distinguished panel of people who have devoted their talents and energies to political campaigns on either the inside or out. Each of the panelists will speak to you briefly about their work, and we will then take questions on either of the microphones down here on the ground floor from the audience. I'd like to begin by introducing Mr. Sander Van Oker. Mr. Van Oker has had an extraordinary career spanning more than 40 years in print, radio, and television journalism. In the 50s, he worked on the Manchester Guardian, the BBC, CBS News, and the New York Times. In 1957, he joined NBC News, where he served as a White House correspondent and then national political correspondent. In 1971, he left NBC to become senior correspondent for the National Public Affairs Center for Television of PBS, and in 1977, he joined ABC News, and in the 1980 and 84 presidential elections, he covered both the Democratic and Republican candidates. In 81, he served as ABC News chief diplomatic correspondent assigned to the State Department. In 1986, Mr. Van Oker became the anchor of ABC News Business World, the first regularly scheduled weekly business program on network television. He currently owns his own company, Old Owl Communications, and serves as a professional in residence at the Freedom Forum in Arlington, Virginia. Even if he hadn't been such a tough questioner in the Kennedy-Nixon debates, I think he's more than qualified to comment on them. Thank you.
It's very nice to be here on leave from Madame Tussauds. At a stage in life when I thought I'd be at some veterans hospital, gumming down Fig Newtons dipped in Popeye cups of warm milk, waiting for a talent agency to offer me a chance to sell adult diapers with June Allison, I'm asked to go before presidential libraries. A week ago yesterday, I was at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, and we were talking about President Reagan's political legacy, and I couldn't help but think about a brief span, 20 years, which changed the coverage of American politics. I have to tell you that the age of television, political television, didn't really begin with the campaign of 1960, so much it began with the debates. There was really very little coverage prior to the convention. The very first story I did on the race was in, I think Senator Kennedy will remember this, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Dennis Chavez was hosting the Western Democrats. And what was interesting, the senator and a man named Hy Raskin, who died recently, a fine politician from the Chicago school who worked in the Stevenson campaigns, were rounding up votes rather quietly, sotto voce, away from Lyndon Johnson with the aid of Congressman Stuart Udall. I took the film and went to Los Angeles and put it on a Sunday show. Then I repaired to Nevada, and with Mary McGrory of the Washington Star, as it was then, Blair Clark from CBS News, Bob Healy from the Boston Globe, Bob Ruth from U.S. News and World Report, we split 2 weeks with Senators Kennedy and Humphrey. Blair Clark and I did not have cameras. We went along just to get a feel for the campaign. The first and only story I did on the Wisconsin primary, Alan Goodrich has it at the library. It was a show for Chet Huntley called Chet Huntley Reporting. Very little narration. Spent about a week, covered 5,000 miles, and without almost no narration, as I've said, we just intercut between the campaigns. And most of the talking was done by not the senator, not by Senator Edward Kennedy, not by Robert Kennedy. It was done by Rose Kennedy and the senator's sisters. and we intercut their speeches almost following one word upon another. And at the end, it ends with Hubert Humphrey leaning on a bus and saying, "God, I feel like an independent running against AMP." There was some coverage in West Virginia, but the convention was a historic moment. I did an interview, I just looked at it the other day, with the senator before one convention session. But the debates were the beginning of the age of political television. Now, Nixon apparently watched Senator Kennedy give his acceptance speech in Los Angeles and said, "Let's debate him." How did the debates come about? There was a section 315 of the Federal Communications Act, which was dealing with fairness. So Senator Pastore of Rhode Island agreed to suspend this on the urging of mostly Frank Stanton of CBS and Robert Sarno of NBC, and thereby they could hold the debates and not worry about fringe candidates. We got to the debates. I was covering Vice President Nixon and got on a train in Jackson, Mississippi, came to Chicago. Don Hewitt, the producer of 60 Minutes, the voice you heard before, was the producer and director of it. We just assembled in the afternoon, my colleagues, Stuart Novins from CBS, Bob Fine from ABC, and Charles Warren from Mutual Broadcasting. And then we repaired to our homes or our hotels. I was living in Chicago. And then we came in. Now, what we didn't know was that Vice President Nixon was in pain. He had had a bad knee injury in September, and he knocked his knee on a door, and he was in terrible pain. But the thing that we also did not know was that that day he had had a very frenzied schedule of appointments, and one to a labor group, and I think Senator Kennedy talked to that group. But Senator Kennedy spent most of the day preparing for it. The staff work was pretty good for Vice President Nixon, but he disregarded it. He wore a gray suit. They had a gray background, and we didn't see it because we couldn't see monitors. So we had no view except a naked view. And the only thing that I thought was interesting, that throughout the debate, Vice President Nixon spent a lot of time looking at Senator Kennedy, and Senator Kennedy didn't ignore him, but he looked straight at the camera. And it rather reminded me of my young days as a reporter for the Manchester Guardian in London, going to the House of Commons and watching the Labour benches addressing the Tory benches directly, and the Tories, with that wonderful sense of superiority born out of breeding and ruling the country for 400 years, talk to each other. And the question that you saw was a tough question. Stuart Novins was getting to it. I thought, my God, I'll have to drop it. It was originally put to President Eisenhower at a news conference in August by the late Charlie Moore, then of Time and then of New York Times. And it was a legitimate question. In fairness to the Vice President, President Eisenhower didn't treat him very well. He almost had to stand in the back when he went up to Gettysburg while President Eisenhower summoned all these fat cats who had paid for the farm and so forth. And at the time, he and William Rogers, who was the Attorney General after Herbert Brownell resigned in the late 50s, had a very good record on civil rights, all of which was ignored by President Eisenhower. But my question to Senator Kennedy, not remembered, was equally tough, which I said, you have promised to get the country moving again, yet you had a rump session of Congress in August, and you couldn't get anything done at all. Fair and unfair in the sense that it had been arranged by Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, the Speaker, as a way of putting pressure on members of Congress, because they believed if you did that, you could win the nomination, which was a very innocent view of what had happened in American politics in 1960. I didn't know who won. Later people told me Senator Abe Ribicoff, he was then governor of Connecticut, he was the first major large state governor, or major state, to announce for Kennedy in '57. He was driving from Sacramento to San Francisco. He thought that Nixon had won, as many people who heard it on radio did. When I found out that when the party left Chicago that night, went to a place, I think it was Painesville, Ohio, checked into a motel, the next morning, knocking on Senator Kennedy's door very early, was Frank Lausche, who was a mayor of Cleveland, governor of Ohio, and a senator who ran as a Democrat and voted as a Republican I figure if Frank Lausche Weathervane was there that early, Senator Kennedy had done rather well. Now, in the coverage of the campaign, it was very spotty. In those days, I won't bore you with it, we had something called round robin in television. I mean, you'd have to go to a major city or get a phone line into a major city before you could get it on the air. I remember when I was covering Little Rock in 58 and 59 for NBC, John Chancellor did it in 57, we had to get a line into Memphis, and then that would get on the round robin and go to Chicago. Often it didn't, and the excuse always was, well, it was all right leaving Memphis. In case I ever write a memoir, it'll be titled, It Was All Right Leaving Memphis. But you would do a story and then catch up with the rest of the campaign. And I remember once going to Chicago with my producer, Charlie Sieg. The camera crew went down to Indianapolis, and we caught up with them. You didn't have any sense of the size of the crowd. So I sought out one of President Kennedy's aides, Kenny O'Donnell. I said, what was the crowd like? He said, well, let me put it this way. We were driving through empty streets as we came into town. And the senator said, who advanced this trip, Kenny? And he said, your cousin, Joe Gargan. And Senator Kennedy said, where's Joe now? And Kenny said, 3 blocks over, holding back the crowds. On the election night that mattered the most, which was Wisconsin, I had a camera for NBC in the city room of the Milwaukee Journal with a chalkboard. And we wrote Kennedy's totals and Hubert Humphrey's totals. Also, what was important that night, it was the beginning of the game of expectations, because Senator Kennedy won 6 districts and had a 100,000 vote margin in a state where Hubert Humphrey was referred to as the third senator from Wisconsin, and we said it wasn't enough. That was the beginning. It was both print and television in those days. But I promise you that television, apart from the debates, was not a major factor in the campaign of 1960. It was the debates that made it appear that it was the age of television was being born. Now, to go a little farther along, in all the time I covered President Kennedy in the White House, apart from the presidential interview I did with Bill Lawrence of ABC and George Herman of CBS, which I think was taped, I can't remember a time when I did a live report from the grounds of the White House. Even on the Saturday night when there was a break in the impasse about Cuba, we were briefed by Pierre Salinger about 10 of 8. I rushed out to the Radio Shack to get on an NBC radio show called Monitor. It was on the weekends, out of breath, and my colleague Ed Newman said, Sandy, catch your breath, and I did, and I reported it. So it was not a factor apart from, which is a bigger part, from the very successful news conferences that Senator Kennedy held. He was diffident about doing those, but they became quite impressive and were very much a thing that he enjoyed doing and helped him politically. Now, I'll sit down and tell you, I'll talk about what television coverage has become, but as I look into the age of cyberspace and internet and all that television is going to do or have done to it, I can only recall the words of Lord Wellington on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo, when about to face mighty Napoleon with a motley collection of Allied armies. He reviewed this motley collection of Allied forces, and he turned to an aide and said, they may not frighten the enemy, sir, but by God, they frighten me. And that's the way I feel about cyberspace.
Our next panelist is Lisa McCormick. Ms. McCormick is the Publications and Online Communications Director for the Republican National Committee. In 1993, shortly after joining the RNC, Ms. McCormick created Monday Briefing, a newsletter faxed every week to more than 3,000 elected officials, opinion leaders, and members of the media, as well as creating that other bi-monthly political magazine, the award-winning Rising Tide. Before that, she was editor of Campaigns and Election magazine and a reporter at the Washington Times. And lest she can be confused with those other editors who are enslaved to the dying medium of print, Ms. McCormick also launched the RNC internet site Main Street, which, as I was told by one campus Democrat here, is a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. On a personal note, my father worked on your father's presidential campaign. He was one of the advancemen, and he worked on the inauguration. He was in charge of entertainment and transportation, and then he served in the administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury. So I think I feel very comfortable here today. I'd like to start out into the general and then get into the specific. It's a perfect topic, especially after watching the debate, that 30 years ago a young president did take us into the new frontier. And from television cameras to spaceships, he embraced it. You could just see it on the monitor. He was leaning into it. Nixon was holding back. It was very comfortable. And I think that a lot of people, just as Sanders said, it's tremendous in its progress, the technology wedded to politics, but some people are frightened in its potential. But I think there are certain lessons that John F. Kennedy taught us, is that if you understand technology and embrace it, then you can control it and become its master. I feel strongly that, yes, the mother's milk of politics is money, but the coin of the realm is information, and information is only as good as your delivery systems. And that gets us directly right into technology. Because the delivery systems isn't the retail politics of block captains or war chairmen. It's technology. And it's being used to organize and energize your base, communicate your message, especially most importantly in an unfiltered manner, fundraising, and then least of all for the moment, persuasion. It also raises a lot of questions in a lot of different areas, constitutional, philosophical, ethical, cultural. For instance, the internet. It's absolutely, take it from me, the wild, wild west. Constitutional questions arise, all kinds of questions. Who's going to control it? What kind of information? Who will have access to it? And who won't have access? And why do we, the most electronically connected nation in the world, why do we feel more disconnected than ever before? Which leads all of you who are students here to the challenge, is that as technology advances further into campaigns and our daily lives, how do we use it to connect people with people, candidates with people, and then people with their government? I don't have all the answers. Nobody on this panel has all the answers. But I do know this. Big centralized institutions, be they corporations or countries, need agility, velocity, and adaptability to survive. And since I am from the Republican National Committee, in short, they need to be decentralized. In early 1993, after the, in our eyes, disastrous 1992 election, Haley Barbour used cutting-edge technology to, in essence, decentralize the Republican National Committee. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, but always remember, all communications is personal. All communications, one-on-one. It doesn't matter what delivery system you use. And we use all delivery systems. The U.S. mail, telephone, magazines, newspapers, radio, broadcast TV, cable TV, satellites, faxes, computers, email, internet, wide world web, CD-ROM, individualized cassette tapes that we mail to voters. We use every single one of those. And we use them to basically explain what wasn't very well explained at all in 1992. And that's basically, what do you believe in? Why do you believe in it? And to address the issues and the ideas of the party. Now I'll get into the specifics. This is where the RNC is right now. And where we are in the presidential race is the candidate is out of money. So we'll be playing a big part. To start with, the press operation. We have built a computer database of 47,000 media contacts. And the press office sends out on an average, just an average, 8 press releases a day to 1,000 reporters, editorial page writers, editors. And then we have targeted press releases, because appealing to the mainstream press isn't even close to being enough. We have targeted op-eds, letters to the editor, and radio actualities that are tailored to Asian, Hispanic, and African American media, Catholic, Jewish, college media, environment, energy, foreign affairs, and international trade media, and then also small business and veterans. In the radio world, the RNC can book, write, record, produce, and edit radio actualities for candidates and members of Congress. We feed them into a 6,000 radio station database on a digital feed. And if radio stations want to know what the RNC has to say for that day or for the week or even the 2 weeks previous, they can call a 24-hour hotline toll-free to find out and to get from that hotline the digital quotes and feed it into their news stations. And primarily that's done because a lot of radio stations, they don't have a bureau in Washington, which leads us directly into GOP TV. There's a state-of-the-art television studio in the basement of the RNC, which once housed storage. It produces Rising Tide. It's a weekly 1-hour cable television show that has the capacity to reach 50 million households. On the local level, people gather, those who don't have cable access, they can gather in hotels, bars, schools, wherever there's a satellite dish, and they do in great number gather to watch the show. We have daily news feeds. We send out camera crews to cover GOP events in Washington, and then they're edited in the studio and sent out to television stations all over the country without any commentary or voiceover. And we let the television stations know how they can bring them down on satellite and who's going to be covered through a fax network and a wire service. And then meanwhile, whatever Republican candidate or elected official is appearing on those, I guess they range from about 30 seconds to 90 minutes. Some go as high as 5 minutes. The candidate or the elected official can contact the local stations, and they can pull them down over the satellite. We have interactive interviews. Again, a lot of television stations don't have the money to have reporters in Washington. So we organize it. We bring in the candidate or the elected official into our studio. And the people back home interview the candidate live via the satellite from our studio. We've done over 1,000 interviews that way. And then we have secure teleconferencing. It's totally out of the question in terms of money and time wasted to send operatives to state to state to state for training seminars or to share strategy or breaking new information. So what we do is we use, again, the satellite with scrambled receivers. And Haley Barber and any number of people in, again, the basement of the studio can hold conferences. Nobody has to go anywhere. For the convention, we're going to use 17 hours of unfiltered coverage. We're going to be the first political party to cover our own convention. We'll have a 30-minute daily morning show on USA Network, a 2-hour daily show in prime time carried on News Talk Television, and 5 2-hour specials on the Family Channel. And basically all of this is done because you have to get your message across. You have to put forward your issues and ideas, and you have to have everybody singing off of the same song sheet. A poll just came out. It wasn't really a poll, it was a study just last week. It was the Freedom Forum, as a matter of fact. And it certainly surprised me, others say that they're not surprised by it at all, that 89% of the Washington press corps voted for Clinton, which is terrific. People can vote for whomever they want. But it also lets you know that you have to get your message out. And whether you face, the rest of the press corps that's, well, just leave it that way. Now we'll get to this, the things that I'm in charge of. As John said, we have the Monday briefing. But what happens with the Monday briefing? We fax it out to about 3,000 different groups, different individuals. They take the briefing, which is 7 pages. It has a legislative calendar. It has a calendar of GOP events. We take one issue that we pretty much know is going to be the hot topic that week, and we give a 1-page talking points on it. And we also include a suggested letter to the editor or a press release. And what happens is the people who then receive it can add their own local information to it and their own cover sheet, and then they can send it out. So when we say 3,000, I don't really know what the number is for how the briefing gets sent out, because one state alone can put it on their fax tree and send it out to at least 2,000 more, and then those send it out, and then those send it out. The Republican Forum, that was our little putting our toe into the water of the internet. I loved your summary, Senator Kennedy. It was absolutely perfect, right on the money, but I hate to say it, but Bush was nowhere near to be found on the internet. And I'm not saying he lost the election because of it, but it was very interesting. They did offer him that. He did not accept it. So the RNC was dragged, not kicking and screaming, but very eagerly into what was then, unfortunately, totally uncharted waters. We went on to CompuServe on February 1st, 1994. We've had 50,000 users since then. 175,000 RNC documents have been downloaded. 182,000 messages on more than 20,000 topics have been discussed. And we have 7,700 people regularly on our email list who download immediately and automatically, for instance, press releases, talking points. The magazine can be accessed. Now we're going on to AOL. We'll be there in early June. We're just putting a teaser page together with some of the basic information, and we're doing that to allow people to have more easier access from AOL to our internet site. And our internet site I'm very proud of. We went online October 4th, 1995. It's called Main Street. The address, if you want to look it up, is www.rnc.org. 250,000 people have accessed it. 10,000 people have signed our guest book. And for an overview of the site, you can send your email address. Send us an email to info@rnc.org. And we're also going to have a convention site on Main Street. So if you want to experience the Republican National Convention, it might be a place you'd want to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. We'll have it on our internet site that you can also access at www.rnc.org. I guess in conclusion, all of this, it is retail politics in a basic sense. It's getting the issues where you stand and why you stand for them. And it's communicating that, and everything else follows. That's about it. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Catherine Moore. Ms. Moore currently serves as Vice President of the Dewey Square Group, a consulting firm specializing in grassroots communication strategies for political and business concerns. Formerly the Communications Director of the Democratic National Committee, Ms. Moore was also the press secretary not only to Tipper Gore during the 1992 campaign, but before that was also the press secretary for the Progress and Freedom Foundation and the Democratic Leadership Council. She got her nuts and bolts campaign experience the hard way, working for Senator Kennedy's successful 1994 re-election campaign here in Massachusetts, and she is now actively engaged in providing communication services for the Clinton-Gore re-election campaign and re-election committee. Excuse me. Please.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little more informal and stay right here for the moment. I have to tell you there are a lot of reasons that I'm here today. Number one, it's an honor to be here. Number two, I can take notes on what Lisa's saying and go back to the DNC and share that information. When we watched the video a few moments ago, Lisa and I whispered to each other, wow, look at that, what's different from that debate in 1960 to what we experienced in 92 or 94 and perhaps in 96. And all I could think of was, and I've been there in the staff room with the laptop, with technology, online, checking facts. And so the other reason I'm glad to be here today is to tell the Senator, thank you for doing such a wonderful job in 1994 that we didn't have to do that kind of work. That's a perfect example of where technology can change the work of a campaign. Now, Lisa's done a lot of the work with you. This is not necessarily like the space wars of President Kennedy's era. We have access to the same technology. The two parties make different choices occasionally. The RNC has made a decision to invest $3+ million in television. The DNC has made a decision to engage its money in some other priorities. I think they balance one another out by the time you get to the end. What I'd like to talk a little bit about are the differences in philosophy, perhaps, where the Democratic Party has gone with its philosophy and its use of technology. And there are three specific things. The first is that in 1960 and the following years, I think people became concerned that with the advent of television and its impact, that voter contact would be lost, that there would be no more standing on a soapbox on the street corners, that there would not be public forums like we're seeing now. I would suggest that the Democratic Party has been committed, in fact, to taking technology and bringing field operations in a campaign together with press operations in a campaign, and in fact making it even more able for a party, for a candidate, for a campaign, for an elected official or leader to reach voters, if not directly, if not through more avenues of the media, then also to empower surrogates further down the line, supporters, a governor for a president, a mayor for a governor, a ward captain, those folks that Lisa just discussed, the ability to communicate internally in a party structure and a campaign organization is just as critical as it is to speak directly to a voter. And so that concept of decentralization and voter contact, and in fact a grassroots campaign, is the primary philosophy behind Democrats engaging in technology. The second issue is defense versus offense. Now, we can talk a lot about how with satellite feeds we can operate on the offense, the passage of the president's controversial 1993 budget. I was at the DNC then. We have the Harriman Communications Center, which is a television studio facility in our national headquarters in Washington. Senior surrogates, members of the president's cabinet, were able to come in, as Lisa described, engage in one-on-one interviews with television stations around the country. Now, to me, the important thing is not that they were able to get a senior cabinet official on television. Any one of the networks could have provided that, but that it was with a local anchor who could ask questions of local concern and would give that elected official or that candidate the opportunity to answer a question about how it affected the quality of someone's life locally. That, again, takes you back to the grassroots. But any party, any political entity would be remiss, and especially the lessons Democrats learned in 1988, if we didn't take the opportunity to use technology for defense. If we didn't take the opportunity to use satellites to find out about an opponent's commercial. If we didn't take the opportunity to use the Associated Press and Reuters and other wire services now available through our laptop computer screen or sitting at your desk to know what the opposition has said about you and leave no allegation, no charge, and no attack unanswered. That has a lot to do with the success you saw in 1992 on the part of President Clinton. None of those charges went unanswered. His message got out, both his proactive message and the ability to blunt attacks from the opposition. You know, a brilliant moment in technology, which leads into my next issue of access, is what a good friend of mine who was part of the president's campaign in 1992 did in New Hampshire. And that was to deliver videotapes to the home of targeted voters in New Hampshire of Bill Clinton speaking directly to voters. It wasn't what ABC produced. It wasn't what CBS or NBC or CNN produced, but it was his own videotape. And you would sit down in your living room and watch. And that went to 20,000 homes by hand, just like the old days, just like the door-to-door campaigning. But the key is that all of those homes have VCRs. People have the ability and the access to the information and the tools, which leads me to my third point of access that I think both parties have to watch and that Democrats are committed to, which is this technology is critical. This technology can be helpful, but it is also a double-edged sword. And if you commit all your resources and all your time and attention and energy to those tools of technology, you've got to make sure that people have access to them. Just as we move into an information age and the way it affects our economic or our social structures, it will affect our political structures. The rich versus the poor, those people who choose to engage or have not been encouraged to engage or energized to engage. Those are the things that parties have to be a part of. Those are the things that campaigns have to be a part of. And remember that fine balance. As Senator Kennedy said in the opening remarks, these are not the answers to everything. None of the technology replaces the quality of a candidate or the quality of his or her ideas. They're merely a tool, and I believe Democrats believe, that they need to be used in that sort of context and in that sort of format to share information, to make sure that misinformation is not spread about you, and to do what you can, in fact, to engage others and help them come to the age of communications and information technology. And those are the philosophies that I think most Democratic candidates, the Democratic committees are all engaged in, and I think it's going to be a big part of our success in 1996. Thank you.
Our final panelist is John Perry Barlow. Some years ago, while the rest of us were still at our electric typewriters, John Perry Barlow and his friend Mitch Kapor, who started Lotus, founded the Electronic Freedom Foundation. EFF is the largest information resource and advocacy group devoted to protecting the rights of Internet users from excessive governmental interference and regulation. And Mr. Barlow writes and lectures extensively on these and other issues related to the electronic community. Mr. Barlow prepared for his role as information age prophet as a Wyoming rancher for 20 years, and is certainly the only Republican county chairman who wrote lyrics for the Grateful Dead in his spare time.
Thanks, John.
Credentials of staff.
He used to work on my ranch. This is how I got to be here. He wasn't a bad hand. Once again, I find myself in one of these contexts where I feel like we're aboard the Titanic and talking about how the shuffleboard tournaments are going at the moment. We are failing to recognize that it's not so much how the president gets elected as what the president is, what the office becomes. And I think most of the emphasis that was placed on the Kennedy-Nixon debates was on their having been decisive in the outcome of the election. I think more to the point, they were decisive in what the presidency became after that, which was the imperial televised presidency, president as celebrity. And this has led us into a condition where we are now more interested in affect than intellect, where we're more interested in haircuts than the head underneath them, where we're interested in the sex life of the candidate and not in his ideas. And I think that this has led us also into a condition where we are now increasingly governed by a system that consists of hallucinating mob. Because we have the major medium whereby people determine their map of the world being something that exists by selling the attention of the audience. And human attention is something that is relatively easy to garner. You can do it readily with sex, fear, and violence. And so we are now in the television era of politics, and the Internet, I think, has come, and none too soon, to help us get out of that era. But in the fashion by which it's likely to get us out of that era is going to be profound. It's not simply going to fine-tune the information process. It may well eventuate in the death of the nation-state. If you take a look at how the nation-state grew up over the industrial period, you now see that we are at the climax point in the mass state, the mass culture, and the mass society. It's downhill for all of those kinds of things from here, and you can see demassification taking place across the board. On the Internet, everything is local and global, but nothing is national. There are no national boundaries, and there is a complete disconnect at this point between the government of the United States of America and the Internet. I mean, in February, the government of the United States of America passed a law which made it unlawful and punishable by severe criminal penalty to utter many of the words that I've heard frequently uttered in the Senate dining room on the Internet, as though they had either the right or the ability to do so. The government of the United States largely consists of people who are not only clueless about the Internet, but are dynamically anti-clueful. Because, with all due respect to Senator Kennedy, who I must say has been trying, and I'll know that he's serious about it when I send him some email and get a response back from him. The Internet is not a mass medium, and everything I've heard here today talks about treating it as though it were. It's not a broadcast medium, and it's not part of the United States. It is cyberspace, which is an extraterritorial and anti-sovereign condition that may completely eliminate anything but the most ceremonial role for the presidency of the United States. So while I think that, in this particular election, there probably isn't going to be a great effect that the Internet is going to have on the election, I think underneath you will see the erosion of the very office that is being decided. And new changes are taking place that are not going to be on the media landscape, and all I can tell you is get yourself a net connection if you want to find out what's really going on. Thanks.
Thank you. If folks have questions, we'd ask that you come to the microphones, and again, we'd ask if you just keep them questions and not statements. Thanks.
Please. Thank you. My name is Eric Christopherson. I'm a junior here at Harvard College. I wanted to thank you all on behalf of the Student Advisory Committee for being here today. My question is, over the past couple of weeks, we've watched as Governor Weld has tried to recover both physically and politically from his fainting spell that he had. And I think it talks a little bit about what Mr. Barlow has talked about, in the sense that it seems that a lot of people have argued that all this attention that people receive on their television appearances and the way in which they must act on television kind of erodes at the more substantive issues of a campaign. And I was wondering if any of all of you could speak to how much do you think the more substantive issues on the campaign are compromised by the presence of this increased technology?
I'll say that I think they are. As a career press secretary, the amount of time that I request with a candidate or an elected official to spend worrying about, it's not 50-50, but every time I ask for 5 minutes to worry about how he sounds, how she stands, what color suit she's wearing or he's wearing, is 5 minutes of briefing time on policy that's not happening. So the reality is, yes, it does. It takes away. But it's also a part of the human condition that any time you engage one-on-one before someone goes up to a podium to speak in a very direct appearance like this, that you worry about what they wear, how they sound, what they look like. Is the hair combed? Is the part straight? Just like your mother, scrub them behind your ears before you go up there. So I think it does.
One of the things on the internet, I mentioned the number of people and the number of discussions and back and forth, is because you put your information up there and there are no distractions. There are no hairstyles to comment on and inflections, body movement, and let the issues stand for themselves. And something like the internet, it allows you to do that. And it allows you to do it in an unfiltered manner, and it's just you and your computer, and you're reading exactly where they stand on something. So it's a pure information flow. And then we have a chat room. You can go into the chat room, having read one of the position papers, and discuss it with people.
That's a very important point. Affect is non-existent on the Internet. It's all text to a large extent. And there's some video if you've got a high-speed connection, which most people don't. But the problem is that the people who are on the Internet at this stage of the game are people who are generally very discouraged with the political process as it exists. They are not voters by and large. They are extremely well informed, and they're better informed about the substance of the issues than I would say the rank and file of the voters. But they're very discouraged with the process. The voters, the principal market in the voting public is very television-based. It's older than the Internet population, and it's focused around that technology and not computer technology.
Thank you.
Question.
Hi, Mr. Kennedy. My name is Bert Huang. I am a graduating senior and also a member of the Student Advisory Committee. Thanks for coming to the IOP. I'm interested in knowing how increasing use or reliance on the Internet is going to affect the role of money in politics.
You go first.
I'll take it. As I said, it's the wild, wild west on the internet. I can't imagine when the FEC is going to catch up with what's happening with politics on the internet. We at the RNC took it very slowly. For instance, I studied the internet for 4 months before even beginning to put together a 19-page document to give to the chairman, like, this is why we may want to go on the internet, this is what we can do. But addressing your question about financing is that purposefully we went up in October, we did not put credit card capabilities on. We didn't want to put credit card capabilities on because we didn't want to give the impression that we were grabbing people by the ankles, holding them upside down, and shaking them until all their loose change came out. We are going to put credit card capabilities on in about 2 weeks flat. How it's going to change it, two different ways. One is fundraising. Yes, you can do some fundraising. We've already had 2,000 people join the Republican Party in the most archaic way. You know, download the form, fill out the form, put it in an envelope, put your check in the envelope, and mail it to us. And thousands of people have done that because of the internet. But I think one of the other interesting things, and correct me if I'm wrong because everybody's guessing up here on this panel, trust me, is that it might be on congressional races, it may offer a level playing field because putting up an internet site doesn't cost a great deal of money, it just costs some know-how. And also I'd like to add that right now you need a $2,000 PC to get even access to the internet, but right now it's $500. You can get internet access, email, your faxes, the whole 9 yards. So at the moment, I think it's something like households with incomes 40,000 and above, 60% of them have PCs. And I think it's going to be broader use of the internet because the price is already coming down to $500.
Those are her voters, not my voters. That's one of the differences.
They're all our voters.
So. I think it's also going to help enhance, as Lisa said, to a certain degree, increase your low-dollar donors, increase the small contributions, which I think representatives from both parties believes is a good thing. The more participation you have in the financial support of politics, the healthier and cleaner it is. So there's always that benefit. But how to measure it yet, I'm not sure there's really a way yet.
If someone from the age of the pharaohs can interject, you're assuming that all this determines mass shifts in American politics. It may be that they do. But I remember the images of Barry Goldwater leading a perfectly respectable march away from Nelson Rockefeller and the Eastern establishment of the Republican Party, hurting himself by two phrases were not entirely felicitous. I remember the Democratic Party doomed for at least more than a decade because of Chicago in 1968. I think of the 1988 campaign, Dukakis. The convention was run by two people named Dwight Hemian and Gary Smith, marvelous producers of television musicals. And had Dukakis let it in their hands, he probably would have won. In '92, Clinton put it in the hands of Gary Smith. The Democratic Party embraced electronics for the first time. I tried to find a counterpart when I was working for Congressional Quarterly in Houston to Gary Smith. I couldn't find one. So those are mass images I'm talking about, and I submit to you that those mass images will overwhelm these discrete communications on the internet in forming what Walter Lippmann in his classic book Public Opinion in 1922 talked about in terms of the pictures in our heads. We carry around pictures in our heads, and I submit to you, I don't think the internet forms pictures in our heads. But I say that because I'm an electronic Luddite.
My name is Andrew Brodsky. I'm an employee at the Kennedy School. It seems that this is a question for Mr. Kennedy, but also I'd address it to the panel. It seems that politicians are increasingly portrayed as celebrities and entertainment icons. And Mr. Kennedy, as editor of George, you've put entertainment figures such as Demi Moore and Howard Stern on the cover of your magazine. I'm wondering if you could discuss the role and the responsibility of the media to take politicians and politics more seriously.
Well, I'm not part of this August panel, but I think John Perry said it best, which is that really and I came to the game late, but we're all in the business of harvesting attention. And unfortunately, too often politics and political magazines particularly, because I think that they really did not follow the rest of media. Too often they sit on the back shelves of newsstands, read by, women by 8% of political magazines, but 80% of regular magazines. And the question is, if in an election year you're going to try to get a new audience of people interested in politics, then you're going to have to use some tried and true methods that other magazines, that other forms of media have used successfully. And I think the surprise, that with George or with other magazines is that the gestalt impression that makes someone buy a magazine and what's actually inside is there's a difference. And as far as we're concerned, anything that you can do to sort of get people interested in politics, then that's half the battle.
This will sound ironic after what I said in my statement, but I actually support, I work with John on George, and I support his methods there, because I think that there has to be a transition from the society that we've created, the political process that we've created, which is very much a celebrity-based system, into one where people can start to think about ideas again. But you first have to engage the populace in the process. And right now, I would say the populace is not particularly engaged in the process, except in the most dutiful kind of way. They're not deeply engaged. They feel disempowered, generally speaking.
Can I just, in this great age of information we have, and when television was introduced to the World's Fair in New York in 1939, even though it had been perfected in England a decade before, our greatest essayist, E.B. White, called this the Chautauqua of the air. If you accept that the 60 campaign was the beginning of the age of television, then you can take a chart and show the turnout has gone from the mid-60s downward except for 1992. So if information shall make you free, if knowing more will help us participate, what went wrong as information spread? I think it may be familiarity breeds contempt. Great leaders like de Gaulle, Churchill, Roosevelt understood there has to be a certain aesthetic distance between our leaders and us. I subscribe to what Edmund Burke said to the electors of Bristol. They canned him right after he said it. He said, I owe you not my industry and my allegiance, I owe you my judgment. If everybody is now talking in the Sea of Babel, or the Tower of Babel, B-A-B-B-L-E, how can our elected officials maintain aesthetic distance and make judgments in this new world of information? I'm profoundly depressed. I don't think they can.
I'd like to say one thing. When I forgot to mention my baby, Rising Tide magazine. One of the things in designing the magazine, and the Republican Party hadn't had a magazine for 2 years, was this magazine has to appeal from people 18 years old to 80. What am I going to do? What are we going to do? So I decided to have a classic format, but have it with a twist. So I'm very proud the Kennedy School, after 3 years, God love them, subscribed to Rising Tide. You can find it in the library. But you'll note that the art is fun. And you have to, I understand exactly, on putting the celebrity, I had to go against that and not have a cult of celebrity. As a matter of fact, Gingrich and Dole have only appeared, their pictures have only appeared in the magazine twice. Once. Dole's appeared twice on the cover once he became the presumptive nominee. But you have to attract new people into politics, and sometimes you have to put a pork chop in the window.
You got to explain that.
Let me explain. Okay. Pearl Nesta was a great Washington hostess in the 50s and 60s, and people were saying, oh, how do you get these fabulous people to come to your dinner parties? And she said, honey, sometimes all it takes is just putting a pork chop in the window and people will come. So it's a bait.
One of the things I want to add real quickly to this is not just about, I think part of what Sandra said is all of this technology also brings a dilution of the existing technologies. You have 62 channels to pick from tonight on your cable station. How am I going to make sure you watch CBS to see the press conference I had today if I'm a candidate? The other piece of it is not only the options you're given because of the technology, the lives of our families today, what you compete against for the single mother getting off of work, picking her kids up at daycare, getting dinner made, getting the bills paid that night by herself, getting a load of laundry in and getting lunches made for the next morning, and then she'll think about what Governor Jones has to say on the 11 o'clock news. I mean, every political message is competing against a lot of things in a family's environment today that have maybe increased and expanded over the last 30 years.
Just one quick point following up Mr. Van Oker's remark. I think that there's, this will sound contradictory again, but, that one of the problems we've got in the political process in this country is that our leaders are in data shock right now because the people have become extremely good at bombarding them with all kinds of well-formatted, densely detailed and footnoted documents on their positions. I mean, it's a rare congressman that has an attention span of more than an elevator's ride worth. And I think that we have, what this drives toward is much more decentralized systems of government where people can handle the information flow. Because it seems to me the government that we've got in D.C. at the moment is fibrillating from too much information.
We have time, for only 2 more questions, so if we can.
Hi, my name is Deborah Gittin. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School and at the law school. Ms. McCormick and Ms. Moore, you alluded a little bit to problems of access, and I'm wondering, you've talked about a lot about using the computer as a vehicle for improved information dissemination and improved participation. This isn't available to everybody right now. The average American may have a VCR, but not a personal internet hookup. What, if anything, are the DNC and the RNC doing to make sure that low-income and rural communities have access? Or if you don't see it as your role, who do you think should be in the forefront?
Actually, it's interesting because I think the most important thing about the issue of access and the ability on the internet and computers to communicate is not so much direct voter communication, although that's a benefit. I mean, the DNC went online first in 1993 and went up with CompuServe and not just prepared materials but held the first forums with officials. But I think our ability to communicate right down the line of fighting soldiers, if you will, into the local community so that surrogates can go to the PTA meetings and the local political gatherings so that you can share the information not necessarily directly with voters but other surrogates who are in those communities. The other thing is that in 1993 the Democratic National Committee began a significant program of making sure that all the state parties were armed and equipped. California's financial base is a lot different than the Rhode Island State Party or the Oklahoma State Party, and making sure that all the way down to the grassroots level we began arming our local parties with that kind of technology so that they could help share the information in its while being communicated in its high-tech form, but when being served in ways that everyone has access to it. The other thing we did was we have significantly engaged in the radio issue. We'll never win the war of who has better or more famous talk show hosts, but we can certainly use technology to get out through free airwaves on radio, more democratic message in more races and more places. And we've engaged in a large-scale program of a database, 1-800-actuality lines. I mean, Lisa and I share a lot of technology between the two parties that both have.
Well, I think another thing is that Speaker Gingrich made a comment a year and a half ago that he would very much like to have every child in America to have a laptop. He was laughed at. The good news is that in every school, more or less, there's at least a computer. My son is in a pre-K right now, and he's taking computer lessons. I don't think that there's anything that a political party can do right now to get the access. Technology itself is going to take care of that. Oracle company is coming out again with $500. You can have access to the internet. We can try to get more computers into schools, more children trained on computers, because that's exactly what's going to be their future. And more, that's where they're going to be getting their information. There's already, this is great, this is really neat for techno junkies. There is a computer, it's about as big as a big picture, like you put over your couch. And it's 3 inches deep. It is a television set. It is a computer, and it is a telephone, and you can customize everything. You can customize, okay, I want this show downloaded, I want it, taped. It's going to be it's amazing. Right now it's, of course, about something like $25,000. But what's happening right now isn't revolutionary. This is my big point. It's evolutionary, and everything's going to be tied together. And again, the economies of scale, a $2,000 PC today is, well, think about when television came out. It was only the rich families, that had television sets. And then slowly, more and more families got the television set brought in. I think that's going to be happening with the technology today. Just have to wait.
Last question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Judy Canales, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and I've certainly appreciated the opportunity to see you all here today. And I wanted to take the question perhaps another step further, in the sense that you mentioned, she referred to low income and neighborhoods and communities that may not have had so much access to what we're discussing here today. I want to take it to another step in the sense of communities in particular, such as African American, Asian, Latino, people who different languages, and discuss perhaps what efforts both the DNC and the RNC are doing to get the messages out to those voters.
Oh, it's basically one of the things I mentioned in my talk is we have people in charge in the communications division with communicating with the media, the Hispanic American media, the African American media, the Asian American, and all the way down the line. It's putting in the magazine, for instance, Republican leaders of those communities, and what are they doing, and what are their ideas, showcasing that.
We engage through all the technology of the different specialty presses and the different trade presses, not just about minority and cultural issues, but also different areas of interest. Part of it's also through our Speakers Bureau, making sure that we connect bilingual leaders from our party to engage in bilingual radio and television, as well as participate in writing in other languages other than English to communicate in those communities. It's also an extension of the very basic services that I talked about, and making sure that state parties and local parties have the technology and the training, making sure that we encourage through our training programs at the DNC, people learn about the technology and learn where they can get help with the technology for those communities and the rising leadership in those communities. And we're engaged in a broad effort in that vein.
All of our radio actualities are translated into Spanish, for instance, made available to Spanish-speaking radio stations. All of our press releases are translated into Spanish. I even looked into putting out Rising Tide in Spanish, but the cost.
Both of these last two questions, though, bespeak a certain habit of mind that we've been using for the last 200 years, which assumes that institutions, governmental or political, are responsible for spreading the good word and enlightening the people. And in this particular instance, I don't think that's where growth or awareness is coming from. If you take a look at how the Internet has grown, it has grown from the edges and not from the center consistently. And the principal obstacles to access at this point are not so much economic as cultural. There has to be a reason to come online. People have to feel like there are others of their own kind there to converse with, because it really is a social space. It's a conversation. And I've been very encouraged by the way in which the demographics of the Internet have shifted dramatically over the last couple of years. It's gone from being about 9% female to being 37% female. There are many more languages available than there were 2 years ago. And it's shifting rapidly, but it's not shifting because of any governmental or political process. It's shifting because the users are making it so.
Thank you very much. That concludes our program. I want to thank our panelists for their remarks. And I want to thank the audience for their interest and attention. Have a good day.